welcome back. This is Miss Farah over here. You guys are taking COM1108 public speaking, and you guys are currently in week 11. Welcome. So, ladies and gentlemen, I understand that today is in fact a public holiday. However, we still have to complete our tasks. You guys still have to do your tasks, and I'm going to give you guys one whole week. So, for this one week, I want you guys to be watching the video. So there are two things that you have to do here. The first one is for you to watch this video. And once you have watched this video, at the end of the video, I will be doing a simple quiz. So what I want you guys to do is that I want you guys to answer this knowledge check in another Blackboard task, which I will be showing you guys at the end of today's video over here. All right, so let's get started with our class for today. So what we're going to study today is different methods of persuasion. Now, in this COM 1108 class, you guys have learned two different types of speeches. So you learn informative speech and you also learn persuasive speech. Now, the reason why persuasive speech is slightly harder as compared to informative speech, it's because of the methods that you have to do in order for you to persuade people. And when you want to persuade people, it deals a lot with your critical thinking, which we will be doing very briefly in our class for today. Right. In today's class, what I will be covering are four different things. So the first one, how do you build your credibility if you want to persuade people? Number two, how can you use evidence, in particular a case study, when you want to do a persuasive speech? Number three is that we're going to be learning on different reasonings, different types of critical thinking skills a little bit, if you can say it. And lastly, we'll be looking at appealing to emotion, which is another type of critical thinking that we are going to learn in our class for today. So the first thing that we're going to cover is into looking at credibility. And I understand that in our presentation one and presentation two, I have been telling you guys to establish your credibility as a speaker. And I mentioned to you, in order for you to establish your credibility, you have to relate to the topic. You have to tell people who you are in order for you to talk about this topic. And the same thing applies here, in particular to persuasive speech. So when you're talking, the audience would have their own perception, whether or not you as a speaker would qualify to talk about the topic itself. So the main question here is, who exactly are you to talk about this topic? And one of the major and the most important thing that people will be looking at when you choose the topic that you want to talk about is to look at one's competence and one's character. So when we want to look at the competence, we want to know if you have the content knowledge, if you know the stuff that you want to talk about. And the character is your values and moral that you portray as a speaker. And you might be shocked that in 3 minutes of speech, you or the audience would be able to look at these two things, impedance and also character, even just for a short speech. And it's very incredible. Right. So again, as I mentioned, when we're looking at competence, we're looking whether or not you as a speaker has the intelligence, has the expertise, and also the knowledge of the subject. And number two, when we're looking at the character, again, we're looking at how sincere, how trustworthy you are, and how you are concerned about the well-being of the audience itself. All right. So these two are the two characters that are most important when you want to establish your credibility, especially in persuasive speech. Now, there are three types of credibility over here. The first one is the initial credibility. Now, initial credibility is when you want to establish your competence in the initial part before when you want to start talking. And number two is the derived credibility. Now, derived credibility itself, like we see here, is produced when he or she, the speaker itself, is doing the speech, currently doing the speech. And lastly is terminal credibility. Now, terminal credibility is established towards the end of the speech. When you are almost ending at the speech, we will be able to see the credibility itself. So basically, by looking at these three different types of credibility, you know that credibility is not something that is portrayed once. It's seen towards like the whole process of the speech itself. We have initial, we have derived in the middle, and lastly we have terminal, which is towards the end of the speech itself. Okay, so when you want to enhance your credibility, you have to be able to explain your competence. So if you have a PhD in the topic and you feel that this is something that is your expert area and you want to talk about it, so that is when you are establishing your credibility. Number two is for you to establish the common values and common grounds with your audience. So tell them the reason why I want to talk about this is because this topic is very sensitive, and I feel that we need more Malaysians to be able to be aware of the topic. Establish something that is common with your audience in the sense. And lastly, in order for you to enhance your credibility, you need to be able to deliver your speech very fluently, very expressively, with a lot of convictions. Okay? The next thing is also for you to be using the evidence. Now, we talk about how you want to become a better speaker and you want to establish your credibility is by using and making sure that you are knowledgeable. So, using evidence is one of the best ways for you to do it. So, we have talked about supporting your materials in the beginning of the semesters before. So, this is something that is very common for you, right? So when we want to use evidence, we are looking at the supporting material. So one of the important things that I did not touch about when we talk about supporting materials is the quality of your evidence. And in today's class, very briefly, we will be looking at that. So before we move into that, we have to understand a few things about evidence. So when you want to use evidence, there are four things that you have to think about. So the first one, whether or not you should use a specific or a general evidence. Now, this is really depending on your topic, but the best way for you to choose the best evidence is actually looking at the very specific evidence to the topic that you're looking at. Because when you have a very general evidence, it's not going to help people to convince them to see that this is something that's important. This has a high significance. So by using a specific evidence, you will be able to attract your audience and to make them understand and aware that this is something that is very big. Number two is to make sure that the point of your evidence is very clear. Now, a lot of people think that when they use evidence or they use statistic, that's it, that's enough, I'm done. But it's not just about that. So if you go back again on the rubrics or the marking scheme that I used to mark your presentations, you'll be able to see in the body paragraph marks, I have marked for clear supporting materials. So what we're basically looking at is whether or not you are able to explain the evidence, explain your supporting materials in order for people to understand your point. Number three, the most important thing is that to be looking at the source of your evidence. Now we want to see and we want to have a look at the evidence. So if the evidence, all right, so if the evidence that you are looking at is from Wikipedia, which is something that is not very, it's quite shaky in a sense. So we're looking at which sources that you're looking at, which here. Is it something that's very relevant today? So this is also one of the most important things in evidence as well. And lastly, you have to use novel evidence, and the evidence that you choose must have a novelty, must have a significance, must be relevant. Okay, so these are the important things that you have to remember when you want to use evidence in your speech. Now, as I mentioned, we shall be also be looking at the quality of your evidence. And before we want to look at the quality of evidence, we need to look at the reasoning itself. So we're going to touch a little bit more on critical thinking in a sense because we want to evaluate your argument. And this is something that is very, very important in persuasive speech. Right, so firstly, what is reasoning? So reasoning is a process of drawing a conclusion based on the evidence itself. So we have a lot of evidence and we want to formulate an argument for it. So that is basically reasoning. So four things that we are going to talk about today. First is reasoning from specific instances. Second, reasoning from principle. Third, causal reasoning. And fourth, analogical reasoning. Aren't you glad that this is not coming out in your test too? So firstly, we're looking at reasoning from specific instances. So reasoning from specific instances is we're looking at the argument itself that moves from facts to general conclusion. So basically, you have a lot of facts and you want to formulate a conclusion from those facts. So three things that you have to bear in mind before you want to do this is number one, you have to bear in mind that you should not do overgeneralization. So you must not generalize too hastily. You should not jump into conclusion without enough evidence. So in a sense that you have to be very, very careful with your words and you have to reinforce your argument with a lot of statistics and also testimony. Again, this is something that you guys have learned before in your supporting material. Go back again on those slides, go back again on the recording if you do not understand on this. So this is an example from reasoning for specific instances. So we have three facts over here and we want to draw one conclusion from these facts. So the first fact we have here, my physical education course last term was easy. My friend's physical education course was easy. The third fact is that my brother's physical education course was easy. So you want to draw into conclusion that maybe physical education courses are easy. So you have three different facts and it's all coming from your own testimony. The first fact is your own testimony, and then you have your peer testimony, and you have your brother physical course was also easy for him. So you want to conclude that physical education courses perhaps is easy. So remember back again, even though that these are the cases, but you need to avoid hasty generalization. All right. Number two is we're looking at reasoning from principle. So basically reasoning from principle is the opposite of what we talk about just now. So reasoning from principle is going from something that is very general principle into one very specific conclusion. And again, there are some tips if you want to use this. So the first one is for you to pay very special attention to your general principle. Number two, you need to be able to use this to help you to persuade your audience. And number three, you need to be able to support your minor premises as well. Now let's have a look at the example of reasoning from principle. So when you have a reasoning from principle, again, we're looking at something very general and you want to formulate like a very specific conclusion. So here, the first premise that we have, all people are beautiful. So let me give you an example. We have 10 people over here. And the argument on the first premise that we say is that everybody, all 10 people here are beautiful. The second premise that we have here, Farah is a person. Now we understand that person and people is synonym. It's basically the same thing. So we can say that Farah is beautiful because she is included in the 10 people over there. So this is again opposite from what we have earlier. So we have one very general. The first premise is something that is very general, and then you want to go into very specific conclusion. Okay. Now, next we have here causal reasoning. Now, causal reasoning is a type of reasoning that seeks to establish the relationship between causes and effects. All right, so the example over here is because the sidewalk was slippery, I fell and broke my arm. All right, so this is something that is daily done, unlike reasoning from specific instances. A lot of us in daily life, we often do this because we want to basically, we want to, we want to connect our experience. So by saying that because this happened, this is also happening as well. So you want to establish the relationship between the causes and effect, and a lot of people, they do a lot of causal reasoning. All right, so a few things that you have to remember when doing causal reasoning is that it is deal with a lot of question of fact or question of policy. You cannot escape causal reasoning as because a lot of people, they use it in a very daily routine. And the two common errors that we have to do or we have to avoid when we want to use causal reasoning is number one is the fallacy is a type of fallacy is a type of weak argument. You should never use fallacy. So fallacy is um, should not be done when you are doing reasoning. So two things that you have to avoid when doing causal reasoning is number one, fallacy of false cause, and number two is to assume that one event only has one cause. Okay. So next here we have analogical reasoning. Now, analogical reasoning is a type of reasoning where you as a speaker, you want to compare two similar cases and you want to infer that one is true because the second one is true because the first one is also true. So a few things that you have to remember when you want to use analogical reasoning is you have to make sure that the two cases that are being compared is something that is very similar and very alike. Number two, you have to remember that when you want to argue on a new policy, you have to have a look at a country or a place that have tried the policy before. And this is very important because you want to see the implementation of it itself. Then lastly, it is very likely for you to persuade your audience if the analogy would be able to show a true parallel situation itself. So an example for analogical reasoning is that you see one very athletic person and say, oh, you're good at tennis, so you're probably good at ping pong as well. So as we all know, tennis is when you have, two rackets and the person is, sitting. The mechanism, what I'm basically saying is that the mechanism of tennis and also ping pong games are almost alike. So we can say that it almost have the same analogy. So it can be said that if you're good in tennis, you're probably be good in ping pong as well. So just now I mentioned about fallacies. Now fallacies again are bad argument. You should never use fallacies. And I want to briefly introduce you guys. And I know that some of you guys are taking CRI as well this semester. So this is something that is very easy for you guys if you have taken CRI before. So fallacies are errors in reasoning. This should not be done when you are giving your argument. And in today's lesson, we shall be looking at red herring, ad hominem, either or, bandwagon, slippery slope, invalid analogy, appeal to tradition, and appeal to novelty. So the first one we're looking at is red herring. So what is red herring? So we all know, I don't know if you guys, herring is a type of fish. And red herring is basically the origin of red herring is actually one prisoner has escaped from the prison, and he's very smart. What he did is that he jumped into the sea full of red herring, and it is used to cover and divert people's attention from him. So basically, red herring is a type of bad argument that introduce irrelevant issue in order for people to see that issue instead of seeing what exactly is the subject that we're talking about. So an example of here is that many people criticize Thomas Jefferson for being the owner of slaves, but Jefferson was one of our greatest presidents, and his Declaration of Independence is one of the most eloquent pleas of freedom and democracy ever written. Clearly, these criticisms are all one. So the argument that we're looking at here, when people criticize Thomas Jefferson for having a lot of slaves, but this person obviously want to direct the attention saying that, but he is one of our best presidents. He's the good one. He did this, he did that. but it does not refer back to our main argument that he has a lot of slaves. So that is the main issue that we're looking at here today. We're not looking whether or not he's a good president or not. The main argument is that people still criticize him for having a lot of slaves. So that is the example of red herring. Number two, we have here ad hominem. So ad hominem is a Latin word and it's basically a type of fallacy, bad argument, when you want to attack a person, when you want to attack the person rather than looking at the real issue itself. So here the example is the head of department has so many interesting ideas on the lab development, but bear in mind that he had held many respectable positions before. So basically you're attacking the person rather than looking at his or her contributions, basically. Okay, so when you want to attack a person, you're attacking the person, but you're not looking at that person's credibility itself. That is ad hominem. Okay. Next, we have here either or. Now, either or is a type of bad argument that forces listener to choose between two alternatives, and that's it. And the example here is that the government should either lower the tax or announce pay rise to all. All right, so you're only giving two options, whereas it could be 10 or 50 more options out there. And why do your argument has to only, have the scope of only two? Okay, so that is either or. We have here now, it's bandwagon. It's very, very easy. Bandwagon is a type of bad argument where you want to do something that is popular because everybody's doing it, so you think it's correct and good. So here, the example will be the lecturer must be right about his facts regarding teaching because he's popular among the students. So you see a very popular person and you think that because he's popular, it's fine that he's saying something, or it's fine that he's doing something not wrong because he's popular. Okay, so if you notice there is this catchphrase in English, join the bandwagon. So bandwagon means something that is very cool, something that is very in trend. So because someone you see is cool on TikTok or Instagram, so you want to forgive that someone when he or she is saying something racist. So just because that someone is popular doesn't mean that whatever that he or she did is good. Next is slippery slope. So basically, slippery slope is a type of bad argument that assume that a first step will lead to something that cannot be prevented. All right, so one small step would lead to something that is so huge and affecting the whole world. So an example here, we have that enabling federal law to control the amount of obscenity in video games is the initial step in progress to the total governmentship control of media authority. So you're saying that by allowing people to control a few amount of something morally incorrect in video games, it's going to control everything around the world. Just because one small step that you take, it's going to affect you something that is very big, which is not the case. All right, so remember, these are bad arguments. Do not do this. Next we have here is invalid analogy. Okay, so invalid analogy is where something that is very similar just now, but this is bad argument. So when you want to compare two things that are often not alike at all. So here we have an example. Employees are like nails. Just as nails to be hit on the head to get them to work, so must employee. So just because you have your own point of view on something and you want to give an analogy that is not the same. So that is a bad argument. All right, do not do this. Next, we have here appeal to tradition. Appeal to tradition is something that is very conservative. It means that when someone believes that when something is old, it's good. Okay, because you see that it has been there for the longest time, then you assume that it's very good. Example here, I don't see any reason to abolish the electoral college. It has been around since the adoption of not since 1787, and we should keep it as long as we can. So because something has been there for a long time, you assume that it's good. Next is the opposite, which is appeal to novelty. Because something that is new, you automatically think that it's good. All right, so here, an example here, you say a church should adopt the 2011 New International Version of Bible because it's 400 years newer than the King James Version. So because you assume something is new, you assume that it's good. Next we have here is appeal to emotions. So appeal to emotion, emotion is pathos. So pathos is when you can have people to feel angry, sad, a lot of mixed feelings, guilty, afraid, sympathetic, proud, all of those things. Um, so as a speaker, you want people to be involved in your speech. So these are some of the emotions that most public speakers will want to do. All right, so when you want to instill fear for people, the topic could be something that is about illness, or it's about economic hardship, or about sexual assaults, or when you want to talk about pride, you want to talk about nationalism, and you want to talk about an ethnic group or something. All right. So one thing that you have to understand when you want to use appeal to emotion is something that is a skill in public speaking, because you need to be able to have your audience to feel whatever that you are feeling about the topic itself. So you have to use emotional language. How do you do that? Is by developing very good examples, very vivid examples, and you have to speak with a lot of sincerity and conviction and passion. Then people will be able to appeal to whatever that you're saying. All right, so a few things that you have to remember when it comes to ethics and emotional appeal: that number one, emotional appeal can be abused for speakers who do not have good causes. Number two, appeal to emotion can also be wielded by honorable speakers for noble causes as well. Appeal to emotion can be ethical when it's used appropriately in certain topics, but it can also be inappropriate if it's on question of fact. And when we're trying to move your listeners to action, never, ever, ever substitute emotional appeals for evidence or reasoning. Okay, so persuasive speech is actually built on a firm foundation of facts and logics. And I hope by exposing you guys to some of a little bit of theories on critical thinking, you'll be able to know if your argument is good or your argument is bad. Okay. So basically, what we have learned today is number one, you have to remember that a listener's audience are listening to people for four different reasons. So the first one is that they perceive that the speaker has very high credibility. Number two, because they won over the speaker's evidence. Number three, it's because they're convinced with the speaker's reasoning. And number four, they're moved and they like when you are able to appeal to the emotion itself. So remember, if you want to be a good public speaker, you have to remember these four things. All right. So basically, if you want to have your persuasive speech, you must be able to support your views with evidence. All right. So now what we're gonna do now is that I'm gonna give you some questions, and I want you guys to be telling me the answers in the Blackboard task. So we're gonna open the Blackboard task over here. So go to week 11, I created a folder just for today's class, and I want you guys to answer this knowledge check. And once you have done this and watched this video, then only I'm going to take your attendance. All right. So thank you so much for joining me. I hope that you guys enjoy your public holiday. Go and reward yourself. And take care, everyone. Bye.